I'm Peter Underwood. This is News from the Water. Could boaters be hit by the police bill? The repressive and draconian police crime sentencing and courts bill, aimed at turning protestors into criminals, also hides another dangerous innovation. It allows the police to arrest Gypsies, Roma and Traveller people, confiscate their homes if they stop in places that have not been designated, and then imprison any adult member of the group for up to 3 months. Now that clause, this move towards an authoritarian state, may have implications for liveaboard boaters. And boater organisations, including the Inland Waterways Association and the National Bargee Travellers Association, have been seeking legal advice. Now the issue here is whether liveaboards, whose homes are vehicles, of course, of a sort, could be affected by the police bill. If so, there may be nothing to prevent the police being called to arrest a boater simply for stopping where CRT has put up an official no mooring sign. Now, one lawyer has suggested that if the boater is a liveaboard and they're asked to move and then don't, and their being there is likely to cause, in the words of the legislation, damage or distress or a nuisance. Now, a nuisance could be as simple as mooring where there's a no mooring sign. Then, yes, in theory, that could give an excuse for an arrest and detention and the criminalisation of that boater. Now the IWA's legal opinion comes down on the other side, but only just. It says the bill would create a statutory basis to charge for vehicle removal, storage and disposal fees where the police removed a vehicle. So could it apply to boats? The definition of vehicle under the Criminal Justice and the Public Order Acts and the Road Traffic Act back in '94 and 10 years earlier define what's a vehicle. And the IWA's lawyers say that a strict interpretation of the wording would include watercraft within the meaning of any vehicle. Whether or not it's in a fit state for use on the roads with or without wheels, which is what it says in the Act. However, the opinion goes on to say that reference to a vehicle being in a fit state for use on roads would suggest that this definition applies to vehicles that can reasonably be capable of achieving or being in a roadworthy condition. And watercraft would at no time be regarded as a vehicle that would be fit for use on the roads. Which sort of makes sense, I suppose, but the reality, of course, is that an authoritarian government will allow whatever interpretation of the law suits them at any one time. Enforcers drive boaters out. Now, hostility to boaters is not limited to government or individuals, and in the cold and miserable second week of January, a group of 4 boats reported that they'd received a warning from Hamlets Council environmental health officers after a complaint from a land-based resident in Mile End. Now, the resident, who claimed to suffer from asthma, said that the boats were running engines and using stoves, both of which, of course, are necessary to survival on a boat in winter. The boaters tell us that the environmental health officers threatened them with a £5,000 fine and told them that the 4 boats were now under investigation. No, those environmental health officers, if that's what they were, didn't inquire as to whether the stove fuel they were using was smokeless, and didn't inquire as to whether the engine was being used for a necessary purpose, such as charging batteries or heating water. They claimed instead to have acted under the Environmental Protection Act of 1990. Now, the National Bargee Travellers Association has made a formal complaint to Tower Hamlets Council, and it says it's aware of recent reports that boaters have been approached by unspecified people claiming to be officers of local authorities with powers to stop them burning wood and or non-smokeless solid fuel in their stoves. They pointed boaters, the MBTA that is, towards a document on smoke control legislation that says that unless a boat in a smoke control zone is emitting from its stove or engine dark smoke, it's not in breach of the Clean Air Acts. And the MBTA suggests that anyone who is approached should ask for identification and a written copy of the legislation they claim to be acting under. It seems surprising that the overwhelmingly Labour Tower Hamlets Council seems set on attacking boaters and siding with house dwellers who are much better placed, shall we say. Properties in Falcon Court, where the incident took place, sell for £500,000 and upwards and rent for £450 a week or more. The MBTA's evidence to a recent DEFRA consultation on urban pollution pointed out that the vast majority of boat dwellers rely on solid fuel stoves as their only source of heating, and are typically on low incomes and more likely to be in fuel poverty. Unlike the housed population, a significant proportion of boat dwellers burn wood as a primary heat source, and this is particularly true of the poorest boat dwellers, whose main or only source of heating is foraged, waste or donated wood. And as journalist boater Mark Doherty pointed out in a recent article, solid fuel stoves on British narrowboats are the primary source of heat and a traditional and integral part of boaters' homes, rather, as he pointed out, than an aesthetic add-on to an existing central heating system as they are in so many trendy places in East London. He went on to say, "People can and do die on unheated boats in winter. I lost a friend to pneumonia and other complications the Christmas before last. He died on his freezing boat alone. We didn't discover his body for 2 weeks. We thought he was away visiting relatives." Even the Canal and River Trust told the government Clean Air consultation it is essential that the needs of boaters are accounted for when drafting any new legislation. So perhaps Tower Hamlets need to think again, but there is a real risk that that sort of action will spread across the country. March on CRT officers. The war between London liveaboard boaters and the London officials of the Canal and River Trust is still being waged, with the National Bargee Travellers Association organising a high-profile march on Canal and River Trust's Little Venice office on Saturday, March the 26th. Now, protests over Canal and River Trust taking away hundreds of mooring spaces on the River Lee in Hackney and Broxbourne, claiming that mooring in these water safety zones was unsafe, have already led to 2 flotillas of boats making a noisy and often musical protest, and, more importantly, attracting national publicity. The boaters registered an initial win after CRT was forced into a further consultation, which backed the boaters and created the River Lee Forum, with representatives from all interested parties. But CRT imposed the water safety zones anyway. They've now put up no mooring signs in all the red zones on the original safety zone maps, ignoring the newly established forum in the process and creating some ludicrous signage with mooring apparently banned on an existing winter mooring stretch. Couldn't make it up. Now, the MBTA says hundreds of boaters have already defied CRT's restrictions so far. At least 154 boats on 295 occasions, according to CRT's own sightings, have moored deliberately in those zones as a protest. And MBTA is now organising a march through one of the busiest stretches of towpath in central London at Little Venice to call out CRT's duplicity as they see it. MBTA says boaters are rightly angry about CRT's behaviour, especially a recent public statement where they are trying to conflate all no mooring spaces in the water safety zones with mooring improperly, as you would on a lock landing or a water point. Now, this, MBTA says, is shameful behaviour by CRT. The National Bargee Travellers Association has already provided CRT with details of where boaters think it's unsafe to moor and where they think it's perfectly safe to moor without blocking the navigation or making any risk to safety. It claims that mooring on the vast majority of the mooring sites in the water safety zones doesn't block the navigation or make the navigation unsafe. But CRT is upping the stakes with what it's now calling the improper mooring process, which may lead to action against boats on the no mooring sites and possibly the loss of licences. MBTA, however, says if CRT uses enforcement over those mooring spaces, it will take the trust to court, and it says the trust doesn't have a legal leg to stand on. CRT bans commercial boats after fish deaths. Now, Canal and River Trust has banned commercial traffic on the Aire and Calder navigation just weeks after reopening the waterway following months of closure due to a major breach. The reason given is that a significant number of fish deaths have occurred in a localised stretch of the navigation at Nottingley. Now, even when commercial barges were limited to slower speeds, apparently, and reduced loads in the past few weeks, the impact of fish has continued, and CRT simply can't work out why. One of the explanations, according to the Angling Trust, is that It's the mobilisation of silt along a particularly shallow stretch of the waterway during the passing of commercial craft. In other words, a stretch which hasn't been properly dredged for commercial boats. And the commercial operators have been complaining that CRT has failed to maintain a proper depth of water on the navigation. On the first commercial passage after Christmas, Canal and River Trust estimated it cited around 100 fish deaths. Now, Sean McGinley, who's the Yorkshire and North East Director for CRT, said his priority was to establish why the fish are being harmed. He said CRT has been told by the operators that to reduce load sizes further would make the passage uneconomic, but he's failed to commit to dredging the section, which is causing the issues. Instead, CRT is planning a series of monitored passages in order to work out the reason for the impact of freight vessels on the fish, and is sampling the water to identify the presence of any toxins. Mr McGinley insists the Trust still supports freight on its waterways and points out that in the last 18 months the Trust has spent £5 million and more to facilitate freight passage on the Erin Calder. Unfortunately, that figure includes repairing the massive breach caused because their structure fell apart, as well as a bit of dredging and replacing paid workers by training freight volunteer lockkeepers, would you believe? Richard Parry, Chief Executive of CRT, claimed the Trust appreciated the frustrations of pausing freight operations, but apparently to continue to operate as normal, knowing that it's likely to cause numerous fish deaths, would be wrong. Dredging, of course, would be right. Selfish and lazy, eh? Now, a tweet from an official Canal and River Trust account, which rather echoed the exasperation of a mother asking her child to clean its bedroom, provoked a pretty mixed response on social media. "How many times do we have to say this?" tweeted CRT Boating. "Close gates and paddles and follow local instructions on locks, or there's no water left for anyone else. Don't be so selfish and lazy. And yes, we know which boat was responsible. There's no excuses," said the tweet. Now, several boaters supported the CRT staff member writing the tweet, with one asking what punishment the boat in question might expect. He was told the boater could have their licence removed. Apparently, who knew? Now, many others questioned the tone of the tweet and the general assumption that boaters were somehow responsible for water shortages, pointing out, of course, that much more water was lost through CRT's poor maintenance and poor repair record. Another tweeter echoed the original tweet, saying, "How many times do we have to tell you to maintain the canal properly and provide adequate moorings and facilities for your customers? Don't be so selfish and lazy. And yes, we do know the organisation responsible. There's no excuses." Tweet for tweet. Removing the smoke and mirrors. Now, such a frank approach as that tweet is not the hallmark of CRT, who have a tendency to obscure inconvenient numbers. My colleague Alan Richards has been keeping boaters in touch with the number of stoppages on the CRT network, giving an idea of just how much of the system was broken at any one time. Alan stopped doing that when the winter stoppages began because CRT had changed their method of reporting again, and its database didn't distinguish between winter works and emergency stoppages. But Alan's not a man to take this lying down, and he's now devised a way of differentiating between winter works and emergency stoppages. And he compares the stoppage database with CRT's published winter works list. And here are the figures for last weekend. 51 winter works and 16 emergency stoppages, giving a total of 67 stoppages in all. Now, in another attempt to bring CRT to book for its fiddling of the figures, Alan has now made a complaint to the Information Commissioner's Office. He's asking them to prosecute Canal and River Trust. He wants them to do it under Section 77 of the Freedom of Information Act. And under that section, it's a criminal offence to alter information with intent to prevent disclosure. And Alan has just made a complaint to the ICO that CRT, as a public authority, and one of its directors as an individual, has breached Section 77. Now, those of us who've watched the bulletin before will know that this relates to communications between DEFRA and CRT prior to CRT's falsification of its 2019-20 annual report. Alan says that as the director involved provided him with a copy of an altered email together with an unaltered copy of that email in the same communication, it should be an easy win in court for the Information Commissioner. But he does admit his action is more in hope than expectation, as since 2012 he's only aware of one occasion where the ICO has actually done its job and prosecuted. It would appear that prosecutions don't take place due to insufficient evidence or timing out. In other words, they don't get round to it in time. Well, we'll see this time. Facilities boost gets pushed down the road. Now, for some years now, Canal and River Trust has been promising to improve facilities, particularly in busy areas like London, yet little has improved. In fact, most boaters would say the opposite is true, with reports from around the country and the whole network of facilities blocks or parts of them being closed or broken and not repaired. CRT itself can't tell us how the provision of facilities has changed compared with 10 years ago when it first came into being. And boaters are left with the dark conclusion that the Trust is simply unwilling to provide figures that will show it as another failure in the way they provide for boaters. But now it seems that any action is being pushed even further down the road, with Helen Hutt, the elected boaters representative on CRT's council, reporting that she has had a 2-hour chat with Darren Burridge, who apparently is the newly appointed project manager who will analyse CRT's customer service facilities over the next 6 months. And in her view, it was good to have a dedicated, objective, fresh pair of eyes with no baggage or prejudices looking at the issue. But Helen doesn't anticipate any actions, of course, saying that we will have some idea where this is leading in the spring, with a, guess what, consultation to follow in the summer. Now in politics, that's called kicking an issue into the long grass. And CRT is a past master when it comes to prevarication. That's it. Talk to you again soon.